Do we really need to read that last part? Claire asked, her voice tight. Why was she nervous? What could possibly be hidden in a document that had already handed her everything? And why did my father suddenly stop speaking the moment our attorney flipped to the final page? I sat there staring at the trust that transferred $1.2 million in company shares to my sister, the same company I had kept afloat when the numbers stopped making sense. My name was nowhere on it. Mr. Reed adjusted his glasses. There is one final condition tied to fiduciary conduct. Claire's hand moved toward the document. It's just boilerplate. But the page was marked. And it wasn't marked for her. Go ahead, I said. Read it. If you're listening from somewhere else, tell me your country and what time it is where you are. I didn't expect this story to unfold the way it did, but if you want to hear the rest, you're welcome to stay. 10 years earlier, I wasn't sitting in a conference room waiting for a lawyer to read a clause that might change everything. I was sitting on the floor of our office storage room, surrounded by invoices, trying to figure out how we were going to make payroll by Friday. Back then, Lewis Holdings wasn't worth $1.2 million in shares. It was barely holding together. My mom had passed away 6 months earlier. My dad, Daniel Lewis, had stopped showing up to the office regularly. Not completely just enough to keep appearances. Enough to tell clients we were still strong, but the actual work, that fell to whoever was left. That was me. I had just finished my degree in finance. I wasn't supposed to join the company full-time yet, but there wasn't really a choice. The numbers weren't adding up and no one else was stepping in. Claire certainly wasn't. She'd moved to New York the year before. Marketing events, brand partnerships, things that looked good on paper and even better on Instagram. She'd fly in for holidays or big client dinners, always dressed perfectly, always knowing exactly what to say. My dad loved that about her. She understands presentation, he told me once. That matters more than you think. What I understood was that we had 3 vendors threatening to suspend service, a line of credit that was nearly maxed out, and a payroll file that didn't match the actual cash in our account. Presentation didn't fix any of that. I remember calling our bank that night, sitting in my car because the office Wi-Fi kept cutting out. Is there any flexibility on the credit line? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Then a careful answer. Ms. Lewis, we've already extended beyond your approved limit. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. If we miss payroll, we lose half our staff. I understand, the banker said, but decisions like that need to come from your father. My father wasn't picking up his phone, so I made a decision anyway. I shifted payments, deferred what I could. Negotiated with 2 vendors by promising partial wire transfers within 72 hours. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even technically clean. But it worked. Payroll went through. No one outside that room knew how close we had come. The next morning, my dad walked into the office like nothing had happened. He asked for coffee. He glanced at the weekly report I'd printed. Looks stable, he said. I waited for him to ask how. He didn't. Claire called later that afternoon. She was at some rooftop event. I saw the new branding draft, she said. We should really push a more premium image. The website feels small. I stared at the spreadsheet on my screen where I had color-coded which bills we could afford to pay that week. We almost missed payroll, I said. There was a brief silence. Then she laughed softly. You worry too much, Nora. Dad always lands on his feet. I didn't respond, because the truth was, he hadn't, not that time. Over the next few years, I became the person who made sure things didn't fall apart. I didn't have a title that matched what I was doing. Officially, I was just financial support, sometimes internal analyst. Unofficially, I was the one fixing everything before it became visible. I handled vendor negotiations, restructured payment schedules, cleaned up discrepancies that had been sitting in the books for years. When we finally stabilized, it wasn't because of a single deal or a sudden turnaround. It was because the bleeding had stopped. Quietly, gradually. No announcement, no credit. Claire started coming around more once things improved. Not for the late nights or the calls with creditors, for the meetings. She had a way of walking into a room and immediately becoming the center of it. Clients liked her. Partners remembered her. She'd sit across from them, smile just enough, and say things like, "We've been repositioning the company over the past year. We." I never corrected her. Not in those rooms. After meetings, my dad would clap her on the shoulder. "That's what I'm talking about," he'd say. "That's leadership." Then he'd turn to me. "Send over the updated numbers when you get a chance." That was the pattern. She was the face. I was the function. At first, I told myself it didn't matter, that as long as the company survived, as long as things were stable, recognition wasn't the point. But recognition isn't just about ego. It's about ownership. And ownership, I eventually realized, is what protects you. There were documents I signed during those years. Routine things, at least on the surface: authorization forms, financial adjustments, internal approvals. I didn't think much about them at the time. They were part of the job I had stepped into without a title. But looking back, I started to notice something. My name was on the operational side, never on the structural side. I wasn't listed as an officer, not formally. I didn't hold equity. I didn't have final approval authority on paper, but I had just enough responsibility to be accountable if something went wrong. At the time, I didn't question it. I thought that was just how family businesses worked. Until one afternoon about 4 years in, I was reviewing a monthly statement that didn't line up. It wasn't a huge amount, not compared to our total revenue, but it was consistent. A transfer labeled consulting fee sent to an external entity I didn't recognize. I clicked into the details. The receiving company had a name that sounded generic, something like Westbridge Advisory Group. No prior record in our vendor list. No contract attached in our system. That alone wasn't unusual. Sometimes deals were handled informally before documentation caught up, but this one had been happening for months. Same amount, same timing. I pulled up the authorization record. It had been approved at a level above mine, which meant one of 2 people had signed off on it. My father, or Claire. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen longer than I needed to. Then I opened a new tab and searched the company name. Nothing meaningful came up. No website. No clear business footprint, just a registration entry with a mailing address. I copied the address into another search. That's when something shifted, because the address didn't lead to an office building. It led to a residential property. And I recognized the street name. It was 2 blocks away from Claire's apartment. I didn't react immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront anyone. I just sat there looking at the numbers, the address, the pattern, and for the first time I stopped assuming everything had a reasonable explanation. Instead, I started asking a different question. What if it didn't? I didn't confront Claire that day. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't yet understand what I was looking at. If I was wrong, I would sound paranoid. If I was right, I needed more than a suspicion tied to an address. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet and kept working. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention not just to the numbers, but to the access behind them. Claire's name began appearing in places it hadn't before. Not on official reports, not on anything that would show up in a standard audit, but in back-end permissions. I noticed it one morning when I tried to pull a transaction log and found that certain fields were now restricted. Access level updated, the system note read, "Updated by C. Lewis." I stared at it longer than I needed to. Claire didn't work in finance. She didn't even log into this system unless she needed something exported for a meeting. Or at least that's what I had assumed. I checked the permission settings more carefully. She now had secondary authorization rights on several accounts, including the one tied to those recurring consulting fees. That wasn't an accident. That was deliberate. I walked down the hall to Lisa Grant's office, our accounting manager. Lisa had been with the company longer than I had. She didn't talk much, but she noticed everything. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone even. "Did something change with account permissions recently?" She looked up from her screen, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Your dad approved it," she said. "Gave Claire broader access. For what purpose?" Lisa shrugged lightly. "He said it was for strategic flexibility." That phrase again. It sounded important. It meant nothing. "Did we document that change?" I asked. Lisa's eyes flicked toward the glass wall, then back to me. "It's in the internal log. Not in a formal resolution. Not in board notes. Not anywhere that would require accountability. Just logged." I thanked her and stepped out. By itself, it still wasn't enough. But patterns don't rely on one piece of evidence. They rely on repetition, and the repetition was starting to show. Claire began attending more internal meetings, but only certain ones. Not the ones about cost control or vendor disputes. The ones about partnerships, contracts, new initiatives. She would sit quietly for most of it, then ask a question at the end that sounded simple but shifted the direction of the conversation. Do we have flexibility on how that's structured? Could that be categorized differently for reporting? Is there a way to route that through a consulting agreement? At the time, no one pushed back, including me, because on the surface, those questions weren't wrong. They were just convenient. Convenient in ways I didn't fully understand yet. One afternoon, I stayed late after a meeting she had attended. The conference room was still warm from the conversation, coffee cups half empty on the table. I pulled up the notes from the meeting and cross-referenced them with the transactions from the past 3 months. 2 new consulting entities had appeared. Different names, same structure. Flat monthly payments. No detailed invoices, no deliverables attached, and all of them had been approved within days of Claire joining those meetings. I felt something tighten in my chest, not panic, not even anger. Recognition. This wasn't random. This was a system. I opened the authorization trail for one of the newer payments. Primary approval, Daniel Lewis. Secondary approval, Claire Lewis. There was no operational review. No financial justification beyond a single-line strategic advisory services. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the pattern forming in front of me. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I printed everything. Not summaries, not reports. The raw entries, dates, amounts, authorization logs. And I didn't leave them in the office. I took them home. That night, I spread the papers across my dining table like I was mapping something out, because in a way I was. Not just the transactions, but the roles. My role, Claire's role, my father's decisions. For years, I had assumed the imbalance between us was about personality, about preference, about who fit better into which part of the business. But this wasn't about personality. This was about structure. Claire wasn't just being favored. She was being positioned. And I was being placed somewhere else entirely. Somewhere useful. Somewhere exposed. I picked up one of the authorization forms and looked at the signature line. My name appeared on several adjacent documents not for these payments specifically, but for related adjustments, internal reallocations, timing shifts, all perfectly normal, all technically correct. But when viewed together, they created a trail, one that connected me to the outcomes without giving me control over the decisions. I sat there for a long time just looking at it. Then I reached for my laptop and opened my email. I searched for the earliest reference to one of those consulting entities. The first appearance was almost 2 years ago. Subject line: New Advisory Partner. Sender: Claire. The body of the email was short. Dad approved this, looping Nora in for processing. No contract attached, no explanation, just an instruction. At the time, I had processed it like any other request. Now it looked different. Now it looked like a starting point. I closed the laptop slowly, because for the first time the question wasn't whether something was wrong, it was how far it went. And more importantly, who would be responsible when someone finally asked. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. By morning, I had made a decision. If I was going to stay in this company even temporarily, I needed to understand exactly where I stood legally, and that meant talking to someone who wasn't part of my family. I called Ethan Brooks. We'd met years earlier through a professional networking event. He was a corporate attorney, sharp, precise, and not easily impressed. The kind of person who didn't soften his words to make things more comfortable, which was exactly what I needed. "Can you take a look at something?" I asked when he picked up. There was a brief pause. "Depends what something is. Financial records? Internal approvals? Possibly nothing. Possibly more." He didn't ask for details over the phone, just told me to send what I had. By that afternoon, I was sitting across from him in his office. Ethan didn't react immediately as he flipped through the documents. That was the first thing I noticed. No raised eyebrows, no quick judgments, just silence. Then questions. "Who controls these accounts?" "My father," I said. "Primary. Claire has secondary access. And you?" "I process. I adjust. I don't authorize at that level." He nodded once and kept going. "Any formal board structure?" "Minimal. It's technically a corporation, but decisions are centralized. Contracts tied to these payments. Not that I've seen." That was the first moment he paused. Not dramatically, just long enough for it to register. He set one of the documents down and looked at me directly. "Okay," he said. "Let me explain this in plain terms." I leaned back slightly, bracing without meaning to. If a company pays an outside entity, there should be a legitimate business purpose. That usually means a contract to find services and documentation to support the payment. I nodded. That part I already knew. "What you're showing me," he continued, tapping the page, "is a pattern of recurring payments without that structure. Could it still be legitimate?" I asked. "It could," he said. "But the burden of proof is on the people making those decisions." He slid another document toward me. "And here's where it becomes a problem for you." I looked down. My signature appeared on an internal adjustment tied to one of the payment cycles. Not the payment itself, but the accounting shift that made it fit. "You didn't approve the transaction," Ethan said, "but you facilitated how it appears in the books." My stomach tightened. "That makes you part of the chain." I didn't say anything, because I understood exactly what he meant. In a worst-case scenario, he continued, if someone alleges misuse of company funds, they don't just look at who initiated the payment. They look at who enabled it to go through without challenge. That sounds like I'd be responsible for something I didn't decide I said. It's not about fairness, he replied calmly. It's about documentation. The word landed harder than I expected. Documentation, not intent, not loyalty, not family dynamics. Just what could be proven on paper. I exhaled slowly. So what do I do? Ethan leaned back slightly, studying me for a moment before answering. You protect yourself first, he said, quietly. How you start by preserving everything. Originals if possible, copies if not, emails, logs, authorization trails, anything that shows who made decisions and who didn't. I nodded. I had already started. Second, he added, you stop assuming that internal processes will protect you. I almost laughed at that, but there was nothing funny about it. And third, he said, his tone sharpening just slightly, you do not confront them without understanding the full scope. Because they'll cover it, I asked. Because they'll adapt, he corrected. And once they know you're looking, the pattern changes. That made sense. Too much sense. I looked back down at the document spread across his desk. For years, I said quietly, I thought I was helping stabilize the company. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Then he said, You probably were. I looked up. But that doesn't mean you weren't also being used, he added. The room felt smaller after that. Not physically, but in the way everything narrowed into focus. I gathered the papers slowly. So I just... Keep going like nothing's wrong. For now, he said. Yes. And if it gets worse, he met my eyes again, then you make a decision based on evidence, not emotion. I stood up, holding the folder a little tighter than before. Okay. As I reached the door, he added one more thing. Nora. I turned back. If there's a larger structure behind this, something intentional, you're not the target. Then what am I? I asked. He didn't hesitate. You're the buffer. I didn't respond, because the truth was I already knew that. I just hadn't wanted to name it. By the time I stepped out onto the street, the city felt louder than usual. Cars' voices, everything moving like nothing had changed. But something had. I wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. I was looking at a system. And for the first time, I wasn't standing inside it blindly. I was standing just far enough outside to see where it could break. I didn't change how I acted at work. That was the first rule I gave myself. No sudden questions, no visible hesitation, no shift in tone that might signal something was off. If anything, I became more consistent, more predictable, because consistency makes people stop paying attention. And right now, that was exactly what I needed. I started small. Every time I processed a transaction, I saved a copy. Not just the final record, but the full chain email request authorization log timestamps. I stopped relying on the company server alone and built a parallel archive at home. Not because I planned to use it, but because I needed the option. The consulting payments continued, same rhythm, same structure. Different names appearing over time, 3 entities now instead of 1. All with vague descriptions, all approved the same way. Primary Daniel Lewis, secondary Claire Lewis. No supporting contracts, no measurable output, just clean entries that blended into the rest of the financial flow. If you looked quickly, nothing stood out. If you slowed down, everything did. Claire started coming by my desk more often. At first, it felt casual. Hey, she said one afternoon, leaning lightly against the edge of my desk. How's everything looking this quarter, stable? I said without looking up from my screen. She smiled. That's what I like to hear. There was a pause, not awkward, just intentional. Then she added, "You've always been good at keeping things under control." I finally looked at her. "Someone has to." She laughed softly like I'd made a harmless joke. "I mean it," she said. "Dad trusts you. We all do. We—" It was a word she used a lot. It created the impression of alignment, of shared responsibility, even when that wasn't the reality. "What are you working on?" she asked, glancing at my screen. "Reconciliation," I said, turning the monitor slightly so she could see the general layout without exposing details. She nodded, then straightened up. "Well, don't work too hard," she said lightly. "We're in a good place." She walked away before I could respond. I watched her go, not because I didn't understand what she was doing, but because I understood it too well. She wasn't checking on the numbers. She was checking on me. A few days later, she came back with something more direct. "Hey," she said, closing the door behind her this time. "Have you ever thought about stepping back a little?" I kept my expression neutral. "From what?" "From all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely. "The day-to-day. The stress?" "I'm not stressed." She tilted her head, studying me. "You've been doing this for years, Nora. It's okay to admit it's a lot." "I'm managing." "I know you are," she said quickly. "That's not the point." Then she sat down across from me. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you." There it was. I waited. "We're moving into a different phase as a company," she continued. "More external partnerships, more visibility. It's going to look different from what you've been handling." And I asked, "And I think it might make sense for you to transition out of operations." The words were carefully chosen. Not leave, not step aside. Transition. To where I asked, she smiled like she'd been expecting that question. "We can put together a package," she said, "something fair. You've contributed a lot and we want to recognize that." "We?" Again. How much I asked, she hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Enough to give you flexibility," she said. "You could take time off, start something new. You've always been independent." I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. Because what she was offering wasn't recognition, it was containment. A clean exit. No conflict, no questions, no risk. For what reason, I asked finally. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. "What do you mean?" "You're asking me to leave a role I've held for years," I said. "What's the reason?" She crossed one leg over the other, still composed. "It's not about you doing anything wrong," she said. "It's about alignment. Alignment with what? With where we're going. And where is that?" She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary. "Forward," she said. It sounded like an answer. It wasn't. I let out a slow breath. "Claire," I said, keeping my voice steady, "if there's something specific you're concerned about, you can say it." "There isn't," she replied immediately. Too quickly. "Then why now?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, just enough to make it feel private. "Because timing matters," she said. There it was. Not a reason. A strategy. I nodded once as if I understood. "Let me think about it," I said. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." But the truth was, neither of us believed that. She stood up, smoothing out her sleeve. "And Nora," she added, pausing at the door. I looked up. "This doesn't have to be complicated." I didn't respond. Because she was right. It didn't. That was exactly the problem. After she left, I sat there for a while, replaying the conversation in my head. Not the words, the structure. She hadn't accused me of anything. She hadn't threatened me. She hadn't even raised her voice. But the message was clear. Leave now quietly, or stay long enough to become part of something you won't be able to step away from later. I turned back to my screen and opened the transaction log again. Same entries, same pattern, same names. But now there was something new layered on top of it. Urgency. Not in the data itself, but in how they were moving around me. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was being managed. And if Claire was trying this hard to move me out, then whatever was coming next, it wasn't something she wanted me to see. The dinner invitation came 2 nights later. Not a text, not a casual mention at the office. A call from my father. "We should have dinner," Daniel said, like it had been his idea all along. Just the 3 of us. It's been a while. It hadn't. But I said yes anyway, because by then I understood something important. When timing starts to matter to other people, it should matter to you too. The restaurant was one of my father's favorites. Quiet, expensive, the kind of place where conversations are meant to sound controlled even when they're not. Claire was already there when I arrived, seated across from him, a glass of wine in her hand. She smiled when she saw me. Warm, easy, practiced. "Nora," she said, standing just enough to make it look polite. "You made it." I nodded, taking my seat. "Of course." For the first 10 minutes, nothing felt unusual. We talked about neutral things, the market, a client expansion, a charity event Claire had attended the week before. It was smooth, too smooth. Then my father set his glass down. "I've been thinking about the future of the company," he said. There it was. Claire didn't look at him. She didn't need to. This wasn't spontaneous. "We've reached a point where structure matters," he continued. "Clear roles, clear direction." I waited. He turned to me. "You've done good work, Nora. You've kept things stable. Kept things stable. Not built, not protected, not carried. Stabilized. Like I was part of a temporary solution." "I appreciate that," I said, "and that's why I think it's time we formalize where things are going," he added. Claire finally spoke. "We're moving into a different phase," she said, echoing the same language she'd used in my office. "More visibility, more partnerships. It requires a different kind of leadership." I didn't interrupt, because I already knew where this was going. My father folded his hands on the table. "I've decided to transfer my shares to Claire." The words landed quietly, but they didn't feel quiet. How much, I asked. "All of them," he said. There was no hesitation, no qualification, just finality. I nodded once, letting that settle before I responded. "And my role," Claire leaned in slightly, her tone soft. "That's what we want to talk about," she said. "We? Always we. We think it makes sense for you to step back," she continued. "Take a different path, something that fits your strengths better." "My strengths," I repeated. "Operational support is valuable," she said carefully. "But it's not the direction we're heading." There it was again. Support, not leadership, not ownership, just support. "And this decision is final?" I asked, looking at my father. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "It's what's best for the company. Not for the family, not for me. For the company." I leaned back slightly, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not anger, something quieter. Clarity. "I see," I said, Claire reached for her glass, watching me over the rim as she took a sip. "We want to do this the right way," she added. "No conflict, no tension, just a clean transition." "A clean exit," I said. She didn't correct me, because she didn't need to. My father shifted slightly in his chair. "You'll be taken care of," he said. "Financially." How I asked. "A package," he replied. "We haven't finalized the details, but it will be fair." Fair. It was a word people used when they didn't want to define numbers. I let a small silence sit between us. Then I asked the question neither of them had addressed. "When does this happen?" Claire set her glass down. Soon, she said. "How soon?" "A few weeks," my father answered. "That was faster than I expected. Not rushed, but intentional, structured, like something was already in motion." I nodded again. "Okay," I said. Claire's shoulders relaxed just slightly. She thought this was going well, that I was accepting it, that I was stepping aside without resistance. And for the first time that night, I gave her exactly what she expected. "I'll think about the transition," I said. "What it looks like." Of course, she replied quickly. "We can work through the details together." Together. I almost smiled. Dinner continued after that, but the conversation never returned to anything real. It stayed on the surface. Because the decision had already been made. The rest was just presentation. When we stood to leave, my father placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You've always been dependable," he said. I looked at him. "I know. That was the problem." On the way home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, because I needed to sit with one simple fact. They weren't just removing me. They were timing it. And timing only matters when something else is coming. Something that requires fewer witnesses, or fewer variables, or fewer people who understand how things actually work. By the time I pulled into my parking space, the decision was already made. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. I was going to leave, but not the way they expected, and not before I understood exactly what they were trying to protect. Because whatever came next, it wasn't just about control. It was about exposure. "Please read the final clause." I didn't raise my voice when I said it. I didn't need to. The room had already gone quiet the moment I spoke. Mr. Reed adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at my father before looking back down at the document. Claire shifted in her chair again, subtle, but not enough to hide the tension in her shoulders. "Nora," she said, her tone measured. "It's really not necessary." "It is," I replied. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the document in front of the attorney, because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a process. Mr. Reed cleared his throat. "The trust established by Daniel Lewis," he began, "includes a conditional transfer of ownership shares to the designated beneficiary, Claire Lewis." He paused, flipping to the marked page. "Subject to the following requirement." I felt my pulse steady, not accelerate. For the first time since I walked into that room, I wasn't reacting. I was waiting. The beneficiary must demonstrate upon reasonable request that she has not engaged in any breach of fiduciary duty, including but not limited to self-dealing misappropriation of corporate funds or undisclosed conflicts of interest. Claire let out a quiet breath. "Jonathan," she said, forcing a small smile, that standard language. "It's just—" "There's more," Mr. Reed continued, not looking up. "Any materially substantiated concern raised by an interested party shall trigger a formal review prior to the finalization of the transfer." That was the part she hadn't wanted read. The room stayed still. Not frozen, just suspended, like everything was waiting to see who would move first. My father finally spoke. "This is a formality," Daniel said, his tone calm but firm. "There's no reason to complicate it." I turned to look at him, for who I asked. He didn't answer. Claire leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "Nora," she said, "if you have questions, we can talk about them privately." Privately, away from the one place where everything was documented. "I don't have questions," I said. That wasn't entirely true. I had plenty. But questions weren't useful here, not anymore. "I have documentation," I added. That changed the room. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone outside would notice, but I saw it. The way Claire's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. The way my father's expression shifted not to anger, but to calculation. Mr. Reed looked up for the first time. "What kind of documentation?" he asked. I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Not everything I had, just enough. "Transaction records," I said. "Authorization logs. Internal correspondence." Claire sat back slowly. "This is unnecessary," she said a little sharper now. "You're misinterpreting internal operations." I didn't respond to her. I kept my attention on the attorney. "These relate to recurring payments classified as consulting fees," I continued, "to entities without clear contractual documentation." Mr. Reed's expression didn't change, but he opened the folder, silently, carefully. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes moving quickly but deliberately. "This is selective," Claire said. "You're pulling pieces out of context. Then provide the context," I said. She didn't. Because she couldn't not in that moment, not without time to reshape the narrative. My father leaned forward. "Nora," he said, his voice lower now. "This isn't how we handle things." I met his gaze. "No," I said, "it's not how you handle things." There was a difference. And for the first time, I said it out loud. Mr. Reed closed the folder gently. "There are enough indicators here," he said, choosing his words carefully to warrant a review under the terms of the trust. Claire's composure cracked just slightly. "That's not justified," she said. "These are operational decisions. There's no violation. That's what the review determines," he replied. My father's jaw tightened. "And what does that mean exactly?" he asked. "It means Mr. Reed said that the transfer cannot be finalized until the concerns are addressed." Silence again. But this time it wasn't neutral. It had direction. Claire looked at me, then not with frustration, not even with anger. With something colder. "You've been keeping records," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" "Long enough." She nodded once slowly. "Of course you have." There was a brief pause. Then she smiled. And that was the moment I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. She wasn't surprised. Not really. She had anticipated resistance. Just not this version of it. "We can resolve this," she said, her tone shifting back to controlled. "There's no need to escalate." "It's already escalated," I replied. Mr. Reed placed the folder back on the table. "I'll need to review this in detail," he said. "And I recommend we bring in an independent examiner to assess the transactions." My father exhaled slowly. "This is turning into something unnecessary." "No," I said quietly. "It's turning into something documented. That was the difference. And documentation doesn't disappear once it exists." Claire stood up, then smoothing her jacket. "Fine," she said. "If that's what you want." Her voice was steady again. Controlled. But there was something underneath it now. Not panic. Pressure. Let's do it properly, she added. We have nothing to hide. I didn't respond, because that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that now they had something to prove. And I didn't. As the meeting broke, Mr. Reed gathered the documents, already shifting into a more formal posture. I'll be in touch within a few days, he said, once we've initiated the review process. Claire nodded. My father said nothing. I picked up my bag and stood. For a moment, no one moved toward the door. Then Claire spoke again. Nora, she said. I turned. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was a prediction. And maybe in her mind, it was a confident one. I held her gaze for a second. Then I said the only thing that felt true. It already has. I walked out before she could respond. Not because I had won. Not yet. But because for the first time the outcome didn't depend on what they said. It depended on what could be proven. And that was no longer in their control. The call came 3 days later. Not from Claire, not from my father, from Mr. Reed. We've initiated the review, he said, his tone more formal than before. I'd like you to come in. There are some developments you should hear directly. I didn't ask what kind. If there was one thing I had learned, it was this. People only call meetings when the narrative is about to shift. When I walked into the office, the atmosphere felt different. Less controlled, less certain. Claire was already there, sitting upright, her posture perfect, but her eyes sharper than usual. My father stood near the window, arms crossed, not looking at anyone. Ethan was there too. That part surprised me, but only for a second. He gave me a small nod as I walked in. Nothing more. Mr. Reed didn't waste time. We've completed an initial assessment of the transactions provided, he said, opening a file on the table. And we've verified several key points. He slid a document forward. First, multiple consulting entities receiving recurring payments have no active service agreements on file. Claire inhaled slowly. That doesn't mean there weren't services, she said. Not everything is documented formally. It does. Ethan cut in calmly. I mean, there's no evidence those services were contracted through the company. Claire turned to him. And you are counsel for Nora, he replied. That landed. Not because of what he said, but because of what it meant. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Mr. Reed continued. Second, those entities are registered to addresses linked to you, Miss Lewis. Claire's expression didn't collapse, but it tightened. These are investment vehicles, she said. It's not unusual to structure advisory relationships that way. It is unusual, Ethan said, to route company funds into entities that directly benefit a decision-maker without disclosure. My father finally turned from the window. This is being framed in the worst possible way, Daniel said. Claire has been expanding the business by paying herself through undisclosed channels, Ethan asked. The room went still. That was the first time anyone had said it plainly. Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at me. You've been building this case for a while, she said. Her tone wasn't angry. It was analytical. Yes, I said. For what purpose? That question lingered longer than she probably intended. Because the answer wasn't simple. Not revenge. Not exactly. Clarity, I said. She gave a small, almost amused exhale. That's convenient. Mr. Reed stepped in before it escalated. There's one more point, he said. He placed another document on the table. This transaction, he continued tapping the page, was executed 6 months ago. A transfer of $180,000 categorized as a consulting fee. Claire didn't look at it. "I know what it is," she said. "It was routed through an entity that was subsequently used to purchase a residential property," he added. Now she looked. Just briefly. Then back up. "That's an investment," she said. "In your name," Ethan replied. "Funded by company resources." My father stepped forward. "This is an interpretation," he said. "Nothing here proves intent." "No," Ethan said calmly. "It proves structure. And structure is what the trust clause was built on." Mr. Reed closed the file. "Based on these findings," he said, "there is sufficient concern to conclude that the fiduciary condition of the trust has not been met." That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that didn't need emphasis. Claire sat back slowly. "So what happens now?" she asked. Mr. Reed answered without hesitation. "The transfer of shares is suspended indefinitely," he said, "pending full investigation." My father's jaw tightened again. That wasn't the intention of the trust, he said. It was exactly the intention Mr. Reed replied, to prevent transfer under questionable conduct. Claire didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just sat there absorbing it. Then she nodded once. "Fine," she said quietly. "If that's the position." She stood up. "Then we proceed with a full review." She smoothed her sleeve again, a small habit I had seen 100 times. Control even in uncertainty. As she moved toward the door, she paused. "Nora," she said without turning. I didn't respond. "You've made your point," she added. "Just be careful what comes next." Then she left. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No slam, no drama. Just separation. My father stayed where he was. For a moment, I thought he might say something. He didn't. Instead, he picked up his coat. "We'll talk later," he said. I didn't answer, because whatever conversation he had in mind, it belonged to a version of this situation that no longer existed. Once they were gone, the room felt different again. Not tense. Just clear. Mr. Reed gathered the documents. "I'll keep you updated," he said. "But for now, you've done what was necessary to trigger the clause." Necessary. That word carried weight. Ethan looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. I considered the question. Not emotionally. Structurally. "Yes," I said. And for the first time, that answer felt accurate. Because the outcome hadn't been decided by persuasion, or loyalty, or who spoke louder. It had been decided by evidence. And evidence doesn't negotiate. As we stepped out of the office, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel like I had taken something from them. I felt like I had removed myself from something that had been shaping quietly for years, and now it was finally visible. To everyone. The investigation didn't happen overnight. That was the first thing people outside the situation didn't understand. They imagined a moment, a single meeting, a decisive ruling, a clear ending. But real consequences move slower than that. They build. They unfold in documents, in interviews, in quiet confirmations that don't look dramatic until they're put together. For weeks I heard almost nothing. No calls from Claire. No messages from my father. Just occasional updates from Mr. Reed, brief, precise, and careful. The review is ongoing. Additional records have been requested. An independent examiner has been assigned. Each update felt small on its own, but together they meant one thing. This wasn't being dismissed. It was being taken seriously. I stayed out of it as much as possible. That had been Ethan's advice. "You've already done the most important part," he told me. "You triggered the process. Now let it run." So I did. I focused on my own work consulting projects, independent contracts, anything that wasn't tied to Lewis Holdings. Because by then I had already stepped away. Not formally, not with a resignation letter or a closing meeting, just gradually. I stopped showing up, and no one asked me to come back. The silence from my family wasn't accidental. It was strategic. If they couldn't control the narrative, they would at least limit the interaction. That part didn't hurt as much as I expected. Not because it didn't matter, but because it confirmed something I had been trying not to see for years. My place in that system had never been permanent. It had been functional, useful. And now that I wasn't serving that function, there was nothing left to hold on to. The official conclusion came in the form of a letter. Not dramatic, not personal, just structured, clear, final. I read it at my kitchen table, the same place where I had once spread out transaction logs, trying to understand what I was seeing. Now everything was written out for me. The investigation had identified multiple instances of self-dealing. Funds categorized as consulting fees had been routed to entities directly controlled by Claire. Those entities had no documented service agreements, no independent deliverables, and in at least one case the funds had been used for personal asset acquisition. The language was careful, measured, but the meaning was not. Claire had violated the fiduciary condition of the trust, which meant she was disqualified from receiving the shares. I read that sentence twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I felt something when I did. I didn't. Not relief, not satisfaction, just confirmation. The next part mattered more. According to the trust terms, if the designated beneficiary failed to meet the condition, the shares would not automatically transfer to another individual. They would be placed into a preservation structure held in trust until a compliant structure could be established. No immediate inheritance, no reassignment, just suspension. I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle. Because that was the second twist. No one won. Not Claire, not my father, and not me. I had expected that intellectually, but seeing it in writing made it real in a different way. A few days later, my father finally called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. His voice sounded the same as always. Controlled, measured. "We need to talk," he said. I looked out the window for a moment before responding. "About what?" There was a pause. "About what happens next." I could hear the shift in his tone. Not authority, adjustment. "There isn't a next for me in the company," I said. "You're still part of this family," he replied. That word again. Family. Used when it was convenient. Absent when it wasn't. "I was part of the company too," I said. "That didn't seem to matter. That's not fair." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. "Neither was the structure you put me in," I said. Silence. Then quieter. "We didn't expect it to go this way." That was the most honest thing he had said. "I know," I replied. "Claire made mistakes," he continued. "But this outcome hurts all of us." I let that sit for a second. Then I asked the only question that felt relevant. "Did you know?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I trusted her," he said. That wasn't an answer. Not really. But it told me enough. "I have to deal with the fallout now," he added. "The company, the auditors, everything. And you will." He said. He exhaled slowly. You could help. There it was. Not an apology, not accountability, a request. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Because a year ago, even 6 months ago, I might have said yes. Out of habit, out of responsibility, out of something that felt like obligation. But that version of me had been built inside a system that no longer existed. I won't, I said. The silence on the other end shifted again. Not anger, something closer to realization. You're walking away, he said. I already did, I replied. He didn't argue after that. He didn't try to convince me. Because for the first time there was nothing he could offer that would change the structure of what had already happened. Take care of yourself, he said finally. You too, I answered. Then the call ended. I set my phone down and sat there for a while, not thinking about what I had lost, but about what I had stepped out of. Because there's a difference. Loss implies something was yours to begin with. This had been something else. Something I had been holding together without ever owning. And now that it was no longer mine to hold, I didn't have to carry it anymore. The first time my phone rang with Claire's name on the screen after everything, I almost didn't recognize the feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hesitation. It was distance. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered, Nora. She said, her voice composed but thinner than I remembered. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up. I almost didn't, I replied. A brief silence settled between us. Not awkward, just honest. I wanted to talk, she said. Without lawyers, without all of that. All of that is why we're talking, I said. She exhaled softly like she knew that was fair. The audit is still ongoing, she said. There are more questions, more requests. Dad's under pressure. I didn't respond, because I already knew what was coming. I need context, she continued. There are things you handled operationally, details I don't have. You had access, I said. Access isn't the same as understanding, she replied quickly. That was true, but it wasn't my responsibility to fix. I'm not involved anymore, I said. I know, she said, but you could be. Temporarily, just to help stabilize things. There it was again. Stability. The same word my father had used, the same role I had always been placed in. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment before answering. Claire, I said, do you remember the night I told you we almost missed payroll? There was a pause. Yes, you said I worried too much. Another pause. I remember. I said. I was the only one looking at what could go wrong. She didn't interrupt. And now I continued. You're asking me to step back into that position. That's not what it is. I said, not raising my voice, just framed differently. Silence again. Then quieter, I didn't think it would unfold like this. I believed her. Not because I trusted her, but because I understood the difference between intention and outcome. That doesn't change where it ended, I said. She let out a slow breath. So that's it, she asked. You're just done. I thought about that for a second, not the question itself, but what it meant. I'm done being responsible for things I don't control, I said. That's not what this is. It is, I replied. That's what it's always been. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought she might hang up. Instead, she said something I didn't expect. You were better at this than I was. I didn't answer. Because that wasn't the point either. This wasn't supposed to be a comparison, she added. It was supposed to be progression. I almost smiled. Progression requires structure, I said, not just positioning. She didn't argue, because she couldn't. I'm not calling to fight, she said finally. I know. I'm calling because I don't know what to do next. That part was real, not strategic, not controlled, just uncertain. And for a moment I saw her differently, not as the person who had tried to push me out, but as someone who had stepped into something she didn't fully understand and then lost control of it. It didn't change anything, but it explained something. You figure it out, I said. How? The same way everyone does when there's no one left to absorb the consequences, I replied. Another pause. Then softly, I thought you'd help. I let that sit for a second. Then I said the only thing that felt honest. I used to, and that was the line. Not dramatic, not final in a loud way, just clear. She didn't try to push past it. Okay, she said, no argument, no persuasion, just acceptance. Take care, Nora. You too. The call ended. I set my phone down and looked around my apartment. It was quiet, not empty, just mine. No files spread across the table, no numbers running in the back of my mind, no sense that something could collapse if I stopped paying attention for too long. I had built something different over the past few months. Consulting work, independent clients, systems where my name was attached to both the responsibility and the outcome. It wasn't as large as Lewis Holdings. It didn't come with inherited weight, but it was mine. And more importantly, it was clean. A few weeks later, I received a final update from Mr. Reed. The shares remained in trust. The company was restructuring under external oversight. Claire was no longer in control of financial decisions. My father had stepped back from daily operations. It wasn't a collapse, but it wasn't what they had planned. I read the message once, then I closed it, because for the first time I didn't feel the need to track what happened next. Not out of avoidance, but out of closure. There's a difference between leaving something behind and finally stepping out of it. I didn't win in the way people expect. I didn't gain the shares. I didn't take control of the company. I didn't rebuild the system from the inside. What I did was simpler. I stopped being part of a structure that depended on me without protecting me, and I proved quietly, carefully that I could walk away with my integrity intact. That was enough. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't come with raised voices or clear villains. It comes wrapped in responsibility, in expectations, in the quiet assumption that you'll keep holding everything together no matter what it costs you. If you've ever been in that position, carrying more than your share, being trusted with the work, but not the ownership, you already know how hard it is to step back. And stepping back isn't the same as revenge. It's a boundary. Forgiveness, if it comes, doesn't mean reopening the door. It just means you stop carrying what was never yours to fix. I'd be interested to hear how you see it. Have you ever had to choose between staying loyal to a system or protecting yourself? And if you want to hear more stories like this, you can follow along. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.